Hello and welcome to the short introduction to the new method for auditing effectiveness in the IOSA program. My name is Beat Jund and I'm one of the IOSA standards managers in IATA, and I will take you through the contents of this presentation. The purpose of this presentation is to explain the changes introduced into the IOSA program to the operators so that operators can adequately prepare for the audit and they know what is expected of them once this methodology starts. Before I start with the details of the methodology, I would like to take a few minutes to give you some background and general information. A number of different reasons have led to the development of this methodology. The 15-year anniversary of the IOSA program, the desire by many stakeholders for a more thorough assessment of some key standards, as well as a risk assessment of the IOSA program are just some of the triggers. Now, when we developed this methodology, we haven't started from scratch, but we have taken an existing methodology which is already out there. We have used a methodology developed by the SMICG, which is the Safety Management International Collaboration Group, which is a group of regulators from around the world who have developed a method for auditing the effectiveness of safety management systems. So we have taken this methodology and we have adopted it to the IOSA program in order, again, to take something which is already out there and which some of you may have already had some first contacts with. Now, it's important to know that there are some limitations to this methodology as we have introduced it into the IOSA program. We are saying we are auditing the effectiveness, however, we are just taking a first step towards an overall effectiveness assessment of, let's say, a safety management system. In other words, we are not doing a fully fledged assessment of an SMS or any particular system within IOSA. However, we are limiting this methodology to a number of selected standards. So we are assessing individual standards for effectiveness rather than entire systems. This is in the interest of making sure that we have enough resources available during the audit, because introducing this new methodology also means additional efforts, additional resources which are needed on site during the audits, and we are currently not changing the number of auditor days which are invested into an IOSA audit. So we have to take a stepwise approach to make sure that we're not putting a strain on the resources during a regular IOSA audit to make sure that the auditors can complete these tasks successfully within the usually 1 week periods that an IOSA takes place. So this is a limiting factor. Again, we are calling this auditing the effectiveness, but again, we're not doing an effectiveness assessment of an entire system, but rather we're doing it on individual ISARPs to learn, to gather experience, and make changes as necessary to potentially deploy it further onto more standards or even entire systems. From a timeline point of view, we are starting with this methodology in the middle of June of this year, 2019. So the methodology will start with the effectiveness or the effective date of the temporary revision to the ISM, which has already been published. And again, that effective date is the 16th of June, 2019. The methodology will be there permanently. That means we will not do a test phase and then take it offline again. But again, the methodology will be there permanently. We will closely monitor how it is going, and we will make changes if needed as necessary based on initial feedback from the field, from the first audits which are taking place using this new methodology. Now, there is guidance available. You have, for one, of course, this short video, which you can use. There is also a temporary revision which has been added to the IOSA audit handbook, which also details all the procedures which I will cover here in this short video for you to read. So please consult this temporary revision to the IAH. It is available through the IOSA documentation website for you to download, and again contains all of the details which I will cover in this short presentation. Now let's have a quick look at what effectiveness means and what are the components of effectiveness. What you see here is essentially 4 elements that we have defined, and we have taken those elements from the SMICG model. The SMICG model or methodology has 4 letters, P, S, O, and E. It's in a slightly different order than you see here on the screen, because I've changed the order to illustrate that we are already covering some of that through our current audit methodology. So what does P stand for? P stands for present, S stands for suitable, O stands for operating or operational, and E stands for effective. So those are the 4 viewpoints, 4 elements that the SMICG has identified in overall effectiveness. And we have adopted that to our methodology within the IOSA program. Now, 2 of those 4 elements we are already covering with the current methodology. So our documented corresponds to the P, which means present, and our implemented corresponds to O, which is operational, operating. So those 2 aspects we are actually already covering and assessing during a normal IOSA audit. Having said that, this is also the only thing, in quote, only thing necessary for conformity with an ISARP. So we are not introducing any new requirements into the IOSA program in order to be eligible for IOSA registration or in order to have a positive assessment on conformity for a particular ISARP. The additional elements of suitability and effectiveness in this overall methodology will be on top of the assessment for conformity and will be at this stage sort of independent. That means the auditors will first look at documentation and implementation and then make an assessment for conformity. Once they have done that, they will move on to these new aspects of suitability and effectiveness, and they will evaluate that in detail for the effectiveness assessment for the individual ISARP. Now, when you look at those 2 columns, suitable and effective, you will see that the heading above it is slightly different. Under suitable, it says discussion basis for effectiveness assessment, whereas above effective, it says required for effectiveness assessment. So at this time, the methodology calls for a slightly different weighing of suitability versus the effectiveness. The reason being that suitability has a certain level or certain risk of subjectivity, which the stakeholders as well as the developers of this methodology felt that at this time it should not be weighed the same way as the effectiveness, which are specific criteria to be implemented by the operators. I will cover that in a bit more detail what that means in just a moment. So this is just a quick overview of what the 4 elements of effectiveness are. And those are going to be audited by the auditors by applying this methodology. Now, before I get into the details of the methodology, I would like to cover a few terms which we have introduced. You see them on the left-hand side, and I will go through the definitions of each of these very briefly. The first one is effective. Now, what does it mean to be effective in our methodology, in our terminology? Effective means the desired outcome as specified in the assessment tool is achieved when an ISARP is assessed as documented and implemented, and additionally defined suitability and effectiveness criteria are fulfilled. So you see in this definition also that for the purpose of conformity, documentation and implementation, nothing has changed. So we're still looking for those 2 aspects. Plus, in addition for the effectiveness, then we will look into further details through this methodology. But for conformity, still, in quote, only documentation and implementation are required. The next term then is the assessment tool. What is the assessment tool? It consists of the desired outcome, suitability, and effectiveness criteria. The IOSA auditor uses the assessment tool to assess the effectiveness of implementation of an ISARP. So when we speak of the assessment tool, it is essentially those criteria provided to the auditor that the auditor is using in this methodology. So that's what the assessment tool is, and you will see an example of that in just a moment. Then we have the desired outcome. That is a statement that describes the result of an effective implementation of the corresponding ISARP. So it's pretty much stating what the ISARP is trying to accomplish, and what should be there, what should be the end result of an effective implementation of that particular ISARP. Then we have suitability criteria. Those are a set of factors to consider if the ISARP is implemented, taking into account the size, nature, and complexity of operations. So when we talk about suitability, usually we take size, nature, and complexity into consideration in order to make the assessment whether something is suitable or not. Then the last definition, or the last word here, is the effectiveness criteria. So those are a set of criteria specifying what an operator needs to have in place in order to be assessed as implementing an ISARP in an effective manner. So the effectiveness criteria, those are more specific, additional requirements, so to speak, that need to be fulfilled, that need to be implemented by the operators in order to have a positive assessment of effectiveness. And again, we will see those in just a moment, what they look like. A few more words about the assessment tool. Again, the assessment tool contains all the individual requirements pertaining to effectiveness on an ISARP level. It is made up of the following three items: the desired outcome, suitability criteria, and effectiveness criteria. So those three things together collectively are referred to as the assessment tool for the effectiveness methodology. Now, where have you placed this assessment tool? You see here a general structure of an ISARP. On the top, you have the normal ISARP text, which can be anything. On the bottom left, you see auditor actions and guidance. So those three things are already there. The assessment tool we have introduced essentially after the ISARP text, but before the auditor actions and the guidance. So that's where you will find in the ISM temporary revision. This is where you will find the assessment tool where it's been embedded. On the right-hand side, you see an actual example of what that assessment tool could look like. We will take that example in just a moment on another slide, and I will cover it a little bit more in detail on that slide. So for the time being, this is just for illustration purposes. Now here are just 3-4 ground rules for the assessment of effectiveness. Again, the first thing I've already mentioned, the basis for conformity is unchanged. In other words, for an operator to be in conformity with an ISARP, we still, in quote, only need documentation and implementation. The assessment for effectiveness comes after the assessment for conformity has been made. So again, we're not introducing anything new for an operator to be eligible to be registered under IOSA or to achieve conformity. Second point is the overall assessment. Now there will be a new ISARP introduced into the ISM in the form of a recommended practice. This is going to be ORG 171. ORG 171 captures the overall assessment of effectiveness for the purpose of this methodology. The main reason why we have introduced a new ISARP is if the operators would like to take corrective action, then we need to somehow raise a non-conformity in order for the operators to actually take corrective actions and channel them through the existing methodology of the IOSA audit. So that's why we have introduced this ISARP. Besides this new umbrella ISARP, there will be no new ISARPs introduced, and also there is no assessment per se, no changes in the conformity assessment of the existing ISARPs. There is going to be a new identifier, a new tag introduced as well. This tag is the EFF tag, which stands, of course, for effectiveness. The reason why we have this tag is to designate which ISARPs need to be assessed for effectiveness. In the initial phase, we have identified 9 ISARPs in total, which will be assessed for effectiveness using this methodology. So it's not up to the auditors to decide which ISARPs they want to assess. However, they have been defined in the ISM with this new tag. Then the last point here is suitability versus effectiveness. Now, those are the two new elements essentially which we are looking into further with this methodology. Now, the key here is that the suitability does not carry the same weight as effectiveness. This is just for the purpose of the initial phase of this new methodology. It is fully clear that suitability is just as important as these effectiveness criteria, which I will show you in just a moment. However, due to the fact that suitability carries a certain risk of subjectivity, it was felt that in the initial phase, the suitability assessment should still be made. However, it should not carry the same weight as the effectiveness criteria. What that means in detail, I will show you in just a moment. So here are the ISARPs which are affected by this methodology. The first one is ORG 171. Again, this is the new umbrella ISARP which is introduced for the purpose of this methodology. It is a recommended practice and it captures the overall assessment of the effectiveness assessment methodology for all the ISARPs which have been assessed. Below that, we have org 312, risk management plus the repeated provisions. So this is the main ISARP which is going to be audited for effectiveness at the start of this methodology. You can see here that it's, and as you probably know, it's duplicated in flight, dispatch, maintenance, cabin, ground handling, and cargo. So in all of these subsections of the ISM, there will be an assessment of effectiveness on this repeated provision. In addition to org 312, there is also going to be two more ISARPs which are covered through this methodology. It's going to be org 3313, which is the flight data analysis requirement, and org 354, which deals with the monitoring of wet lease, codeshare, and capacity purchase agreements. So those are the ISARPs which will initially be audited for effectiveness. This may change over time as this methodology has been developed and as we have gathered first experience, then of course the scope of this methodology may be extended. For right now, those are the ISARPs which are affected. Now, what is the procedure now on a single ISARP? So how do the auditors go about doing an effectiveness assessment? First of all, they will examine the desired outcome. The desired outcome is not something which is going to be audited directly. However, it's just something to keep in the back of your head when you do the assessment for effectiveness. So this is the ultimate outcome that should be achieved if that ISARP is effectively implemented. Next then will be a discussion with the operator on the aspect of suitability. So here, as an operator, you should be able to justify yourself essentially and to demonstrate to the auditor that what you have implemented is actually suitable to your organization. And the main things to consider here are size, nature, and complexity of your organization. So based on these main factors, you should be able to justify and to explain to the auditor why you feel that what you're doing is actually suitable to your own organization, that it meets the requirements and the expectations of your organization when it comes to the implementation. Things that you can use here for your own purposes, of course, are, for example, benchmarking with other operators, with the industry, just to make sure that you are implementing this particular ISARP in a manner or in a way which is industry best practice, so to speak. Next, then, the auditors will move on to the effectiveness criteria, and those will be individually assessed and verified. Depending on the ISARP, there's going to be between 5 and up to 12 additional effectiveness criteria which have to be fulfilled. The key or the focus here is the implementation. So the auditors will look for implementation evidence of all of these individual effectiveness criteria. And as an operator, you are obliged to show evidence of implementation of all of these criteria. Then the auditors will record as needed. We will see in just a moment how this is going to be recorded. And then essentially that's the end of the methodology on a single ISARP level. Now the key to stress here is that no documentation is required for the additional effectiveness criteria. So again, every single ISARP will have, besides the ISARP main body of the ISARP text, will have in the assessment tool additional criteria, which are essentially additional requirements. Now, these additional requirements, you only need to implement. You don't necessarily need to document them. Now, if the operator wants to document them as well, even better. However, for the purpose of the effectiveness methodology that we have under IOSA, no additional documentation is required besides the basic documentation needed to achieve conformity with the ISARP. So let's have a look at an actual example. So again, ORG 312 is one of the ISARPs which has been selected for this methodology. 312 requests that the operator shall have a safety risk assessment and mitigation program, and then there's a number of sub-items, which I will not go through in detail because for the purpose of the illustration here, it's not relevant. So let's have a look at the assessment tool for ORG 312. You will see here on the top, you have the desired outcome. The operator maintains an overview of its operational risks and through implementation of mitigation actions as applicable, ensures risks are at an acceptable level. So that's what we're trying to achieve by implementing ORG 312. Then we have suitability and specific criteria to assess suitability against. Now the key here again is suitability is always oriented to the size, complexity, and nature of operations. So the auditors will look at the number and type of analyzed hazards and corresponding risks, the means used for recording risks and mitigation actions, and safety data used for the identification of hazards. So that's what the auditors will focus on when it comes to suitability. Again, depending on what type of operation you have, the complexity of your organization, the size of your organization, the number and type of analyzed hazards, of course, will differ. So a very small organization versus a very large organization, of course, the number of hazards isn't going to be the same. So that's what the auditors will look at. Also the means for recording risks and mitigation actions, whether you use, let's say, a spreadsheet or whether you use a complex database, will be driven by how complex your organization is. In other words, what works for a very small organization is probably not going to work for a very large and complex organization. So again, another thing the auditors will be looking for here. And then, of course, the completeness of the data. Are you using all of the data in your risk assessment, or are you ignoring some of them? So that's the safety data used for the identification of hazards. That's what the auditors will be looking for here. Then they will move on to the effectiveness criteria again. Those are individual additional requirements which need to be fulfilled. You can see here it's 5 of them. The ORG 312 actually has a total of, I believe, 12. But for the purpose of illustration and to make it readable, I've limited the number here to 5. The rest of them you will find in the temporary revision to the ISM. So the auditors will go through every single one of these effectiveness criteria and make sure that they are actually implemented by you, the operators. And the auditors will check them individually if they are in place. If they are not in place, the auditors will not put a tick mark next to those criteria. And then the readers of the report would see that some of these things are actually not implemented. The focus here again is implementation. So you need to show proof of implementation. There is no need to document all of these additional things, although most likely you will have some, if not all of them, already anyway, if you are effectively implementing this ISARP according to these criteria. How is this all going to be recorded? Let's have a look at the assessment tool, each part of them individually. So the first one is the desired outcome. Again, the desired outcome is not assessed per se. It's just something to keep in the back of your mind when you do the assessment. So no recording for that. Next then are the suitability criteria. So if the auditor comes to the conclusion that what you have implemented is not suitable to the size, nature, and complexity of your organization, then the auditor will make a remark in the auditor comment. So anybody reading the report would see that, okay, the auditor has come to the conclusion that there are some shortcomings on the suitability of implementation. Now, the ISARP can still be in conformity. However, in this particular case, if it's in conformity but not quite suitable, then you would have an auditor comment, which is something new. Next, then the auditor will look at the effectiveness criteria. You can see here in the example, criteria 1 and 2 are implemented, so that's why they are ticked. However, criteria number 3 is not. So in that case, it would not be ticked. And in addition, it would be recorded in the umbrella ISARP org 171. So it would list there org 312 criteria number 3 is not implemented. So that's how the recording takes place. A couple of words on org repeats. So 312 is a repeated SMS ISARP. The logic here for the effectiveness assessment is the same as the SMS. What does that mean? The org ISARP cannot be effective if one or more of the repeated ISARPs are not effective. In other words, for org 312, there is 6 repeated provisions in most of the operational disciplines. So if the repeat to org 312 in flight, let's say, is not effectively implemented, automatically org 312 would also be assessed as not effectively implemented. Okay, and the effectiveness criteria will be ticked based on the repeats. In other words, if criteria number 1 in flight is not ticked, automatically criteria number 1 in org 312 would not be ticked. So the methodology here again is the same as for the SMS. Let's have a look at the umbrella ISARP, which is org 171. You can see it in the bottom right corner. The wording of it, the operator should demonstrate that systems, processes, and procedures specified by the ISARPs identified with the EFF symbol are achieving the designated desired outcome. The key message here is that we're looking for a demonstration of effectiveness. Of course, we would still hope and expect that all of the ISARPs that we have in the ISM are in fact effectively implemented. So we're not saying you should only effectively implement those that have been designated, but of course you should effectively implement all of them. However, for the purpose of this methodology, the EFF designated ISARPs, those are the ones where the auditors will for now have a closer look at the effectiveness implementation. Okay. So org 171 captures the overall state of effectiveness. The final assessment can only be made after all of the EFF designated ISARPs are assessed, and conformity with org 171 is possible only if all effectiveness criteria are in place. So in the end, there's maybe 60 or so individual effectiveness criteria distributed throughout these ISARPs, which have been designated. So in order to reach or to achieve conformity with org 171, every single one of those needs to be implemented. If only one is missing out of those 60, org 171 automatically would become a non-conformity. However, the ISARP would state what is missing, so that is only one part is missing and not all of them. Okay. The suitability assessment does not influence conformity of the umbrella ISARP at this stage. So this is again what I mentioned before. Suitability does not carry the same weight as the effectiveness criteria at this time. So if the auditor has come to the conclusion that the implementation is not quite suitable, it would not have an effect on the umbrella ISARP. However, it would only be recorded in the auditor comment of that particular ISARP. There is no documentation required also for org 171. So again, no additional documentation in any form is required in order to achieve an effective implementation, because the focus of this methodology is on the implementation, not the documentation. So org 171 does not require a document reference in order for it to be assessed as being in conformity. If you have a non-conformity, how do we deal with this? What are the rules? Again, only org 171 can be a non-conformity for the purpose of this methodology. The auditor comment will refer to the ISARP number and the effectiveness criteria number, which is missing. And if it's multiple ones, then of course, the auditor comment would list all of them. There is going to be a standard sentence associated with this ISARP, which you can see here. The operator does not effectively implement all ISARPs designated by the EFF symbol. And again, below you would have the ISARPs which are affected and also the criteria by number. So that's how nonconformities are raised against org 171. Now you might wonder, is corrective action possible in case you have been assessed as not effectively implementing an ISARP or multiple ISARPs? The answer to that is yes. So corrective actions are possible. it's essentially the conventional audit closure procedure which is going to apply. So in this case, again, org 171 is going to be a non-conformity, which means a corrective action record is going to be issued against this recommended practice. So that's going to be an observation, which is at the discretion of the operators whether they want to take action or not. If they want, if you as an operator, you wish to have this observation closed, then of course all missing criteria must be addressed. So every single one of them which was assessed as, or which was identified as missing, they all have to be in place, and you have to be able to show sufficient evidence to the auditors so that they can close this particular observation, non-conformity, in order to have then at the end a positive effectiveness assessment. So that's how corrective actions are dealt with. So those are, in just brief summary, the changes introduced with this new methodology. I will just summarize the main points here briefly. Again, only designated ISARPs will be assessed using this new methodology. Conformity is independent of effectiveness at this stage. That means in order to reach conformity, the auditors will continue to look, in quote, only for documentation and implementation. Now it is, of course, at the discretion of the auditors to also raise issues on the implementation. Let's say there is a very strong lack of suitability or effectiveness ultimately, then of course the auditors can link that also to the implementation. So it is essentially auditor discretion here whether the conformity is affected or whether the auditor wishes to only deal with certain shortcomings through the effectiveness methodology. Okay. However, for the purpose of achieving conformity, we haven't actually changed anything at this stage. Okay. Suitability discrepancies go into the auditor comment. They will not have an effect on org 171. And the missing effectiveness criteria are handled through missing checkboxes and of course the comment for org 171. And as I just mentioned before, no additional documentation is required for effectiveness. In other words, the effectiveness will focus on the implementation, not on having additional documented procedures. Now, having said that, again, in order to have conformity with the ISARP, you will still need the same level of documentation as before, so that's not excluded. You still have to have documentation. However, the additional suitability criteria, those do not necessarily need to be documented. This is at the discretion of the operator, whether the operators want to document these additional criteria or not. That's, in a brief summary, the new methodology for auditing effectiveness. Please refer also to the guidance in the IOSA Audit Handbook Temporary Revision, which has been published through the documentation website. So please have a look at that, download this guidance and also read through it because it contains all of the things which I have covered in this short presentation as well. If you have any further questions on this methodology, feel free to address them to your audit organization if you have an audit coming up in the near future, or also feel free to send them to us for commenting. Thank you very much for paying attention to this. And again, I hope this has helped in your preparation for this new methodology for auditing effectiveness.